So first, I want to just welcome everybody. My name is Dawn Nakagawa. I am from the Berggruen Institute, which is based here in Los Angeles. One of the areas that we focus on is the future of democracy. We're here today to pitch you on this really powerful tool that we believe can help in addressing some of the shortcomings and the crisis that we're facing in our electoral representative democracy. The challenges that we see in Los Angeles are not unique to Los Angeles. We are facing a crisis of democracy at many levels and in many places across the world. The good news is that there is innovation happening and some really exciting innovation, bold and courageous, that really inserts the voice of the people back into the democratic process so that we can live up to that promise of government for and by the people. We believe citizens' assemblies are one such tool and potentially the best one that we have right now. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We've got a great group of practitioners and experts gathered today to talk about what citizens' assemblies are and to go through some case studies and then talk about why we think this might be a solution for Los Angeles and maybe for the state on specific issues that are of the most controversy and the most difficult. What we'll be asking of you at the end of this is to help join this effort to get a citizens' assembly off the ground, either at the city level or at the state level. And we'll give you an opportunity to volunteer to be part of this effort at the end when we do a survey. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we go to that. Okay, so right now everybody is muted during the presentation. There will be an opportunity to ask questions during a Q&A, and you can indicate to the moderators, the Zoom moderators, that you want to ask a question just by clicking your unmute button. It will send a message to them that you've requested to be unmuted, and then I will call your name and you can ask a question. With that said, we highly suggest you actually use the chat. There will probably be questions that occur to you or come up during the presentation, and so it would be a good idea to put them in the chat. What we will try to do is aggregate those questions because most likely there will be questions that a lot of people have that are very similar, and we'll try to go over those during our Q&A period. Let me see. Yeah, please make sure your name is, and I can't see, my view right now doesn't allow me to see whether the names are, I think the names are okay, right? They're coming through. Yes, we've got people's names. Okay. But make sure your name, your name does identify you so that during the question period, we can call you by name. That'd be great. Okay. So I think that's it. I think that's it for the housekeeping, and I think we should get started. So our first speaker is Ramin Sarabi, and he is the co-founder and director of the American Public Trust. He's going to help explain what a citizens' assembly is and give a short and brief introduction to that. And then we will go into some specific case studies from California and around the world so you can learn more about what things happened in those particular instances and how they've been used to resolve some pretty difficult issues. All right, Ramin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Don. And I'll build on the housekeeping. It does seem like a lot of folks are showing up named as Erica Rire. So consider checking to see if you need to rename yourself. We can get your actual name. But housekeeping aside, thank you again for the intro. Let me get my slides up on the screen here. As Don mentioned, my name is Ramin Sarabi. I'm speaking to you here from San Francisco. Brief bio, I'm a first-generation Iranian American, and at this time, as much as ever, it's apt that the promise and ideals of democracy are very inspiring, not only for the folks that are in Iran today, but I think as a beacon for the world. At the same time, growing up, I, like many, found myself disillusioned at the reality of our democracy, and I think that's part of why we're here today, asking what would a more perfect union look like. It's been said in different ways that business as usual democratic institutions are convincing fewer and fewer of their legitimacy and their ability to respond to this moment. This is as true nationally as it is in LA, of course, which is why many of us are here today. At the same time, this is amidst a backdrop of escalating societal issues and polarization. One way or another, the challenges our democracies are being asked to respond to are just getting tougher and tougher. I think as Don suggested, all of us in this room are here because we believe improving electoral politics is not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And there's just a whole bunch of structural dynamics around elections and representative democracy that don't let us respond at the scale that's needed for the 21st century. Fortunately, again, a new paradigm of democracy, we could say, is emerging or re-emerging that can meet these challenges head on. And in fact, the roots of these practices go back to the wisdom of antiquity. Socrates is quoted roughly as saying that democracy by elections leads to oligarchy, and a truer democracy is one supported by lotteries and the sortition process. We'll share more here. At the same time, you can find some of these roots in the country of India and what was happening in the continent there. So this was a co-emergent form of wisdom. We're going to talk about the frame of citizen assemblies, but really this is a larger approach, often referred to as deliberative democracy. And there are a lot of flavors of roughly similar design principles. So citizen panels, juries, councils, same, but different. I just want to get that out there. And if you took away one thing about these approaches in general, it's that they can depolarize and resolve otherwise stuck issues in electoral politics. At this point, in the last 3 decades, there have been over 600 cases around the world demonstrating this, creating breakthrough solutions beyond partisan politics. They are resistant to typical corruption. They unlock wise action. And maybe as importantly as anything, they activate engaged citizens. It's an invitation into a new culture of citizenship that's much more active instead of the passive deference of all of our decision-making rights. I find it's really powerful to actually look at what an assembly looks like in practice. So these 30 folks are all from the state of Michigan. This was a demonstration panel in October of 2020, taking on the questions of how the state should move forward on COVID-19. Again, as divisive as an issue as we could imagine, in the context of an extremely divisive time. October 2020 was right before the elections. There was a plot to kidnap the governor. Amidst all that, this group of Michiganders came together and developed 12 policy proposals that had 70% agreement or higher, which is kind of a remarkable premise when we think about the slight majorities that advance most of our actions in electoral politics. One of the most remarkable cases that is often told is in Ireland. In Ireland, same-sex marriage was constitutionally prohibited. As we would recall, it's a Catholic country. Politically, it's lose-lose for any politician to really touch this. And what emerged was the wisdom to defer this to a citizen assembly. So you had 100 folks, representative again of all walks of life in Ireland, including these gentlemen on the left. This is Finnebar O'Brien, who was a rural postal worker, relatively conservative, and then Chris Lyons on the right, who was a young gay man who, what was at stake for him was the question of whether there was a future for him in Irish society. As it would happen, they were seated at the same table, the same small group table, and they were like oil and water initially. But the breakthrough in their relationship led to Finnebar delivering a speech that was seen as very impactful and moving. And this is, I think, indicative that the shifts that happen at the policy level really are part and parcel with the shifts that happen at the relational level. These are vehicles for breakthroughs through a lot of the polarization and divide. In Ireland, this case then led to this becoming a standard practice for how they handled difficult issues. After same-sex marriage, they took on abortion, which again was constitutionally prohibited. Most recently, they've taken on issues of biodiversity loss, drug policy, electoral reform. It's just part of the culture now. And I think it's a great inspiration point for what this could look like if we embedded it in our own democracies here. Another major case, you may remember the yellow vest response in France a few years ago. Again, there were attempts from the federal government to start to respond to climate issues. But as we've seen in probably many aspects of our own lives, if our voices aren't included in a process, change tends to be resisted, as we saw with the yellow vest response. So Macron and the French government said, okay, we're going to host a citizens' climate convention. 150 Parisians, or excuse me, not Parisians, French citizens got together over the course of 6 months, developed over 100 policy proposals. They're still working their way through the system, but case in point, you might have seen the headline just 2 days ago. This is directly tied to a recommendation from the assembly. They banned short haul flights in situations where you can do train travel in 2.5 hours or less. So this is a sort of remarkable thing that wouldn't happen through electoral politics. This was kind of the wisdom and voice of the people. One other case, again, I'm kind of giving you a high-level breeze through a few cases, and we're going to go deeper in with the speakers that lie ahead. In Austria, they have actually, again, institutionalized this in a way that the community members, if 1,000 of them sign a petition, the state will spool up one of these in response. You can think of it as a pop-up citizen think tank, grappling with, again, the trickiest issues. If we go back a few years ago, we all remember the Syrian refugee crisis and the questions of how to respond. Maybe this helps us recognize that while there's a technical dimension to most issues, at the root of them, there's values-based trade-offs. And too often our electoral politics pits them as zero-sum, when in fact we can find ways forward that honor the spectrum of values from progressive to conservative. And refugee issues were a great embodiment of that. You had concerns about preserving the character of the community, and then you had values around fairness and caring that said, hey, these are folks in need. And in practice, when they were able to put it all on the table, they found a way forward that said, we want to be a community that builds as many lifeboats metaphorically as possible. They're literal words. And the request back to government was to play a role in coordinating civil society actors, in coordinating the volunteer response. So these are the 20 folks from this part of Austria that were part of that process. Okay, so that's some anecdotal stories. If we're going to look at the recipe, the design principles behind these processes, it's really three things. One, folks are selected, as we've said, by democratic lottery, as opposed to elections or appointments. What this means is you're getting a cross-section, a microcosm of the community, sometimes called a mini public, that represents all walks of life around dimensions that as conveners we think matter most. These, again, you can't be exhaustive, but these are things like gender, age, education, race, income, opinion, ideologically on a given issue. They're given good conditions for collaborative problem solving as opposed to adversarial problem solving. This is time and access to experts on all sides of the issue. And then they make their recommendations typically by supermajority. 70% agreement or greater. So this is transformative common ground that lets us move forward beyond typical win-lose politics. I'm going to end with just a few quotes from people that have been part of these processes. What does it feel like as a citizen in these spaces? This is from a gentleman that was part of a panel this last summer in California. He left feeling that working in a healthy community was a reachable goal, energized by possibilities instead of feeling defeated by competing needs. In fact, as he says here, it was not a zero-sum game, and it's exciting to imagine city or municipal leadership that works through this sort of model. This is what the originators of democracy had intended it felt like for this woman, Deb. It was an honor to learn about her community through the process, the ideas everybody holds, and to create new solutions together. So I think I've gone over my time, so I'm going to breeze through here. There's a host of benefits. Takeaway is we believe citizen assemblies can upgrade democracy, and we have a unique moment in LA and in California. Thank you for your time, and I will pass it back to Don and the rest of the speakers. Don, I think you're muted. There you
Okay, there. Okay. I'm not sure I can unmute myself. I'm not in control. But anyway, thank you, Ramin. A couple of things that I didn't mention, sorry, and I should have during our housekeeping is one, we are being recorded, just so you know. And then it does look like quite a few people have logged on and have been stuck with the name Erica Rire. As you said, I looked through the list. There are instructions in the chat for how to change your name, and please go to that and do it. Laura Ryan is the one who's posted the instructions, and maybe Laura, you can post them again just so they're at the sort of top of the chat, or the bottom of the chat, so everybody can see them. All right, so now we're going to go to Lynn Davis, who will tell us about the Citizens Assembly that was held in Petaluma in California. Lynn is the program co-director for Healthy Democracy, and I think him and Ramin make up some of the brain trust we have in our locale around Citizens Assembly. So I'll hand it over to you, Lynn.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So exciting to be here. Thanks so much, Don. And wonderful to see so many people. We're so excited about this. As Don said, my name's Lynn Davis. At Healthy Democracy, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit based in Oregon, but working all over. And actually, as you might imagine, all of us on staff actually have California ties. And our last project was in California, and a really seminal project it was. In fact, California is already a leader in this field. This, we think, was the most intensive assembly. We call them lottery selected panels, but same thing, that we think has happened in the United States to date, although these have been happening at the local government level in particular for the last 50 years. I'm going to talk through some of the nuts and bolts of this, and just as a little bit of background, we're starting off with kind of a very standard kind of introductory process. This is a single issue, single location, one-time project, and it's often a way that these kind of things get off the ground. We'll get into some of the more creative kind of applications of these kind of processes in a few moments. Little background: Petaluma is, as you may know, up in wine country. It's a city of about 60,000 folks. Traditionally, ag. A lot of ag history, although a great amount of population growth in the last few decades. It's not ag related. And that's relevant because the topic in this case was the future of a 55-acre fairgrounds property that's right in the center of town. Such an important and very valuable in multiple ways property that's owned by the city but has been leased to the fair for $1 a year for many decades. And that current 50-year lease is expiring a year from now. Now, this process started about a year ago when the city manager saw a presentation at a conference, and we've been working since then. The political context in this case was that this was easily the most contentious issue in town. Seemingly every single person we talked to on the street or in organizations felt they were a stakeholder. But the political atmosphere was also characterized by two kind of poles of political power that were in a way sucking oxygen out of the rest of the room. And there actually were relatively few people in the general community part of this being part of this decision to that point. On the one hand, there's the fair organization that generally speaking wanted the status quo and wanted to negotiate an agreement privately with the city. There was also a campaign group associated with the fair, Save the Fairgrounds group, and signs all over town to that effect. The city is sort of the other big entity here, and the city certainly isn't unified, but is a pole of power, very much so, and is the property owner after all. The views on council at the time appeared to range from sympathy for the fair to proposals to level it all and replace it with some kind of park. So this situation, suffice it to say, was stuck and highly volatile, aka the perfect recipe for a lottery selected panel. As I mentioned, these are often the kind of situations that these kind of processes come into first. Now, they can be used for a wide variety of projects at all stages of the planning process, permanent and ad hoc in different places in government. But this is often the first place because it's a lose-lose kind of situation for politicians in this case. It's just a very difficult and sticky issue for staff. And so this was a key intervention point. I'm going to walk through some of the elements of this process using kind of our core values behind these processes in general. The first one being inclusivity. As Ramin mentioned, the democratic lottery is the first sort of essential transformative reform involved in these processes. And that means, as a standard, proactive recruitment, in this case, a mailing to 10,000 randomly selected residential addresses across the city, and a promise of radical accessibility. A stipend equivalent to $20 an hour. There's about over $2,000 for the whole project per panelist. Panelists in this context, by the way, is what we call folks who are participating, because they're not just participants; they are on the dais in our mind. Also, sort of personal assistance throughout the process. And as a reminder, one of the key points here is to involve the vast majority of our communities who are not currently involved in any way in the political process, except perhaps voting every once in a while. And that means that if, as in one of our recent processes, 90% of the panel are folks who have never been involved before, that means there need to be a lot involved in making the space comfortable for everyone. That includes simultaneous interpretation and other language services. Let's talk about representation. In this case, after the mailing, folks responded to the mailing, and of those responses, there was a public lottery event. Now, there is an element of self-selection there. Of course, we can't force people like jury service, but because of the sort of active invitation, the offer of payment, and the other elements, the very, very low barrier to entry to get into the process, we see a lot of new folks signing up. But there is a sort of secondary process. So folks respond, and then there's a lottery selection event, where a random but also representative process done by an open source algorithm creates a panel out of those responses. And importantly, it guarantees representation across a number of demographic factors. And that's a very, very important difference than virtually everything we see in our democracy today. This does not aim for representation. It does not work toward representation. It guarantees it every single time on every single one of the factors that are laid out. In this case, there were 7 different demographic factors chosen, or categories of factors. Age, gender, location within the city, race and ethnicity, educational attainment, housing status, and experience of a disability. But there are many other factors, including ideological factors, that are sometimes used. The panel selected was 36 folks. And a unique element about this process was that the city council decided to use an equity-based sort of over-selection, sort of supplementing the targets that come normally from the census. But in this case, they wanted to over-select using youth demographics, and also to compensate for past disparities in participation in city processes, sort of looking at the participation landscape as a whole, and this process as one among others that they are running. Here's what that looked like in practice, and I can't stay here for long, but at the link at the end of the presentation, on the Petaluma project page at the very bottom, there's a demographic profile that you can look if you want more detail of how this sort of filters out across a whole project. In this case, the population in total is the left-hand pie chart. The next one is who responded to the mailing, and this is just the race and ethnicity one, just to select one of the demographics. Can see that folks respond, even with the promise of cash, etc., is still overwhelmingly white. The third one is the reason why we do stratification. The second one is the reason why we do stratification, I should say, because a pure random selection is still not enough. So this, as you can see, is over-selected for people of color. And then the fourth column is what the final panel looked like after alternates and reselection, all the other stuff that happens in the process, still an over-selection for people of color. Now, a third element here is integrity. All of these processes follow a research-based design in terms of how they are created, with transparency always as a priority, but also protecting panelists' individual privacy, kind of like being on a jury, but sort of somewhere in between that and a normal public body, in order to make it as comfortable as possible for everyday folks who don't want to be public officials. Importantly, all of our processes are independently evaluated, and we think this is a really important thing for genuinely all public processes, that they're evaluated by folks who are not paid by the process, no association with the folks who are running it. And there's some reports coming out later, probably next year, about the process, but we have no idea what they say. So a unique element in this category is a robust process, sort of an extra robust process for informational inputs. All the information, the presenters, everything that came to the panel didn't come from us, didn't come from the city or anybody else, came via this stakeholder committee whose members were themselves drawn by lottery, actually from a large list of stakeholders, because how else would you choose who gets to provide, who's to sort of curate that introductory information? And then importantly, mostly by the panel itself, providing its own information. Fourth element, collaboration. The sort of standards here are a structured, iterative process designed from the ground up to prioritize collaboration, not debate, as Ramin mentioned. That is one of the core paradigm reversals of this kind of process. Our current politics, almost across the board, is based on a sort of mental model of debate. And this completely redesigns the architecture from the ground up. This, of course, necessitates professional moderation, a balanced airtime power, and that sort of structure creativity balance. And it also depends on a high level of group cohesion, as you sort of mentioned in one of those stories. This is often built, one of the elements here is building that into sort of the introductory, all hands on deck information gathering. Everybody's on the same page. Before we get to the political issue at hand, we're all here to just gather the best quality information. And that alone, and the sort of prioritization of that process means that the panel creates an internal cohesion that's essential to when they get to the very by definition most difficult issue that they are dealing with. The unique element here is that the panel had a public listening session and workshop that they hosted themselves for other community members. And lastly, but very much not least, is empowerment. The standard elements here are the panel had as much authority as possible over its own process. Even though it was an ad hoc process, we are thinking about these as if they were systems of government, not as tools within the public engagement space. These are system change designs. And so even when we're doing an issue-based project like this, or creating an internal governance structure, for example, for the panel to manage its own affairs as much as possible. The panel has 100% authority always on every project over its own output, down to the very last typo of the very last report, and directly presents to decision makers, in this case, council, no intervention, no mediation by staff or by us. And that's super important and also pretty unique. Decision makers, for their part, before the process starts, commit to, at a minimum, formally responding to all recommendations. And the unique element here is sort of an extra robust subcommittee system within the panel where they acted as their own staff and sort of promoted the longevity of their influence. There, I mentioned the process committee that designed part of its own workshops, the evaluation committee that worked directly with researchers to evaluate the process, the outreach committee, which was essentially the panel's own internal PR firm, to talk about its process, and the policy impact committee, which explained the panel's work to decision makers, kind of acted as its own lobbying firm, if you will. The results, we already saw a clear change in tone between the council meetings that we witnessed sort of at the beginning of the year and the ones at the end. The tensions appear to be slowly cooling, although it's probably too early to really say much about that, but that's what we're observing so far, and knock on wood, that continues. There was certainly a high level of respect from the public and council and fair. One of the councilors said, "This is a new day for democracy in Petaluma," which love to put that in anywhere we can. The panel produced reports that you can see on the website that are sort of cohesive visions for the site, levels of support for different aspects and visualization, and produced a number of clear recommendations that one can see right away as sort of key elements that the panel thinks should or shouldn't be there. We'll learn the real impacts of this panel over the next couple of years because it's obviously a site planning process. And just before I go here, they asked me to touch on just a couple of other things that we work on. We actually got our start working on reforms to the initiative process, to ballot measures, and trying to democratize that system. First, through something called the Citizens Initiative Review, where everyday people, again, selected by lottery from across the state, and it happened in California in 2018, actually, would review a ballot measure and write voter information for the voters pamphlet. Now, that's been run for about 14 years or so, and was one of the first institutionalized forms of these kind of bodies anywhere in the world, in Oregon, and is one of the most studied. There's a link to or the note for there's a book there about the process if you want to read more. But actually, what we realized over time is, gosh, voter information is great, but why the heck aren't these folks? They are so capable. Why aren't they writing the dang initiatives themselves? Wouldn't that get at really the core of what's wrong with that system and realize the original intention of the initiative system, which was to give everyday folks a way to make policy aside from the legislature. And so we've come up with this sort of new concept that we're working on a prototype for, where folks would conceptualize and write the legal language for ballot measures in a course of a couple of very large assemblies. More information at healthydemocracy.org/ICS. And thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Dawn.
I'm in control. All right. Thank you so much, Lynn. This is great. That was great. We're running a little behind, so I ask all the presenters to try to condense your comments. I know there's a lot of rich material here, but we definitely want to leave room for the Q&A. So our next presenter is Yeva. I'm going to mess up your last name, so please forgive me and please pronounce it correctly for everybody. But Yeva Sesnuliatite. I probably just completely destroyed that. But she's the founding head of research and learning at Democracy Next, which is an incredibly exciting new organization that's really around how do we create a democracy that is purely deliberative. I think it's a bold and courageous idea, and I'm really excited about the work they produce. So Yeva, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic. Let me just try to full screen my slides. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Dawn, for this lovely introduction. My name is Yeva Sesnuliatite. I know my last name is a little tricky, but everyone tries, and I'm very grateful for that. So as Dawn mentioned, I'm from Democracy Next, and I'm really excited to tell you about what's next for these citizens' assemblies that you've just learned about. So before Democracy Next, me and my colleague Claudia Schwalis, who founded Democracy Next together with me, we worked at the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, where we gathered the data of citizens' assemblies that happened all around the world, and we were able to find close to 600 examples of these processes in different parts of the world. And so we analyzed all of this data, and we found the different trends that happened there, the different benefits these processes had, and also developed good practice principles for running deliberative processes, as well as evaluation guidelines for these processes. And finally, as one of the latest trends, we've noticed that there have been many ways that governments across the world have started in making these processes a more permanent way. They take public decisions because they saw that ad hoc processes, they're great, but also their impact is limited to the one time that they happen. And so a very short insight into some of the data that we gathered, we actually found that in the past couple of decades, the deliberative wave has been really growing. And actually there's no data for 2022 here, but we see that there's even more assemblies ran over the past year, especially on climate. We also found that these processes took place in many different countries, and we have some data for the US. So 20 processes at the point of the data collection. And very importantly, we also found these processes happen on different levels of governance. So most of them on the local level, but also regional, state, national, federal, and even international. And they have also happened on a variety of different policy issues. So citizens are actually able to deliberate and tackle very complex and very technical issues too. So ranging from urban planning, health, environment, public services, technology, and more. So as I've mentioned, some of the latest trends are actually around institutionalization. How can we make use of these processes on an ongoing basis and give citizens a continuous voice in public decision-making and actually transfer some power to them? So that it all comes to building these new democratic institutions. And we found 8 different ways that these processes have been institutionalized and made permanent across the world. So one of them actually is combining deliberative democracy and direct democracy. So the Citizens Initiative Review example that Lynn Davis has just introduced. There's also in some places, like in Austria, in a state of Vorarlberg, citizens can gather signatures to initiate a citizens' assembly to take place. In some places, there is a requirement to conduct public deliberation according to when certain issues are tackled. But some of the most exciting ones that I find extremely interesting is combining a permanent citizens' assembly with one-off citizens' panels. And an example of such a way of making deliberation permanent is a Paris Citizens Assembly. So it's a process that was established actually around a year ago. So it's also quite new. It's based on a similar model, but in a smaller community, a German-speaking community of Belgium, Ostbelgien, where it runs in a similar way, but in a little smaller scale for already 3 years. And so the way that the Paris Citizens Assembly functions is that 100 residents of Paris, not even citizens, but residents 16 years and older, are randomly selected by lot and stratified, of course, for a 1-year mandate. So they form the Citizens Assembly, which meets multiple times across the year. And it has several different roles that it can do. So number one, it can actually form itself in smaller working groups to tackle the different roles and mandates that it has. And its main role, that's the most exciting, it actually has the agenda setting role and is able to initiate ad hoc citizens' juries. So these randomly selected citizens can decide what is important for Parisian citizens and what issue they would like to tackle in more detail and initiate this smaller citizens' jury of 17, again, randomly selected citizens. And then these smaller ad hoc juries provide recommendations, such in a form of local bill proposals, back to the Citizens' Assembly. What they can also do is propose current affairs questions to the Paris City Council. So to kind of explain certain policies, how they're going, how they're organized, maybe there's some improvements needed. They can also provide a voix, which means a wish. So some sort of a policy they would like to see and see how the council reacts. Can also initiate an evaluation of a certain policy once per year as well, to actually hear from policymakers, from the mayor, from the councillors, etc., about an existing policy issue and evaluate and scrutinize how it happens. And then, of course, it can provide it transfers the recommendations from the ad hoc juries to the Paris City Council in the form of a local bill, and then the council can vote for it. And is required to actually respond right away, and then report after a year of how the process is going. Is the law implemented? How recommendations are treated, etc. So there is sort of closing the feedback loop and reporting back. What is also interesting, that this permanent Citizens Assembly is very much connected to other participatory activities happening in Paris. So it communicates with the Youth Council, with other smaller councils, the European Local Paris Council and things like that. And it also has a mandate to choose the theme of the Paris participatory budgeting, which is actually a huge budget. This year it was 82 million euros. So you see, this assembly really has a variety of different tools at its disposal to make sure that citizens have a real say in public decision making. And of course, because there is a lot going on, there is a secretariat that helps coordinate all of this work. So there is one full-time council staff that's devoted to organizing all of these activities. But there is also an oversight committee, which is formed of representatives of the Citizens Assembly, also a representative from each political party in the Paris Council, and also 4 deliberation experts that help guide the process if there's any questions, and also make sure and oversee that it's really running smoothly. So this process is going to be now evaluated as well, and the report is going to be published of how assembly is running, whether there's a need for any adjustments for the following year. And I also actually wanted to share with you, as I close, some very exciting news. because only last month it was announced that the Brussels city is also establishing a permanent citizens assembly on climate. And so it's super, super exciting. It works also, I'm not going to go very much into the detail the way it works, but in essence, the government was going to raise the first question that the citizens panel randomly selected will tackle. But then a part of these people that were randomly selected to deliberate will have the mandate to set the question for the next panel that's going to be initiated, and then the next and the next. So in a way, this process is going to be launched where these consecutive assemblies are going to happen to discuss climate issues, and recommendations will go to the Brussels City administration, government, and the Scientific Committee on Climate. So with this exciting news, I'll close, and very happy to be here and answer any questions that might arise. Thank you.
Hold on. Okay. Somebody keeps doing it for me. All right. Thank you so much, Eva. That was really exciting. And it is, I think, hopefully it's coming clear that this is not to be, deliberative democracy is not to be confused with direct democracy. A lot of times people who are not familiar conflate those two, but they're actually quite different, and they can be complementary to each other. Direct democracy usually refers to referendum. And in some of our design processes, citizens' assemblies are a complement to that or precede them in some way. But it's not the same thing. So hopefully this explanation is, and these examples are making that clear. Our next speaker is Tomas Gonzalez. He is the founder of Tribu, and Tomas is going to tell us about a deliberative process that took place in Latin America. So I'll hand it over to Tomas.
Thank you very much. Okay, so it is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. The focus of this very short talk will be on sharing with you what we did in Chile, because I think that you should strive for something even beyond that. No? So the first and key message of my presentation is an invitation to you, a call to you, to be bold, to be ambitious on the design, because I think on that ambition is the realize the chances for these mechanisms to go beyond one exercise, but really to be institutionalized into democracy. No? So here in Chile in 2021, we ran a project called D400, or in Spanish, Las y los 400, which is actually the first nationwide deliberative democracy process with random selection done in Latin America, now in the national level. We did it in partnership with the Center for Deliberative Democracy at Stanford University, with the political support of the Senate of Chile and the National Association of Municipalities, and many, many other partners among UNDP, International IDEA, and the Open Government Partnership, who were observers and advisors to the process. So you in LA are very close to the root of all this. No? Maybe some of you, and I know the Berggruen Institute, you're familiar with Professor James Fishkin, who back in the 80s created the methodology of deliberative polling, which by his own colleagues has been called as the gold standard for public opinion and public deliberation. I say that because I think it's very important that you take advantage of being so close and you can collaborate with them. I would be also very, very happy to collaborate with you. But Professor James Fishkin is also one of the inspirations for everything that's been going on the last decade in Ireland. The methodology throughout the last 30 years has been used more than 100 times all around the world, in the local level, national level, and supranational level. with many success. So this is the methodology that we used for our project. The methodology can be adapted with different focuses. For example, with the creation of proposals by the people. Our focus was different, and I'm going to explain that later. And because this is such a short presentation, and I just want to focus on 3 key elements. The first thing is who take part in this. And here my invitation is not only to use random selection, but to strive for the highest standard on representation possible. For example, we gathered a statistically representative sample of 514 people from all across the country. The margin of error of the results was below 5%. We had a proportion of women of 51% and very good distribution on ages and other variables. How did we do this? So it was done during COVID time, so it was very challenging. As you can see, we sent letters, around 45,000 letters all around the country. You can see here in the envelope was the logo of the Senate and the other institutional partners to show to the people that there was this political commitment behind. And the response was very good. And this is the, here you can see the distribution of houses in the country across the different regions. In blue, in dark blue, and in light blue, you can see the distribution of houses that were randomly allotted for our process. And here there was a key decision that I think you should also take into consideration, and is making the process of random selection a tool for involving the general population beyond those that will be taking part in the deliberation. As you could see, we had for more than a month in the news programs, a display inviting the people to accept the invitation. We have spots on TV. We had partnership with all the TV stations, the newspapers, the radios. We had this interactive platform so people could check whether in their block there was a house selected for the process or not, etc. So this part is also very important. Is the possibility is to show everybody that every person has the possibility and the same possibility to be selected, to take part in this. And this is part of the social legitimacy that is behind. As the Greek did in the old days, they had this tool for running independent allotments. We also used a cryptographic tool to be able to prove and to give all the guarantees that the process of allotment, the random selection, was completely independent, even allowing for auditing after the process. So also, and if you're gonna bring this to the city council, for example, I think this is a very important consideration. So last thought on the previous point, the city of Los Angeles and the metropolitan area are big. I mean, you have big populations, between 3 and 4 millions in the city, about 13 millions in the metropolitan area from what I know. So the size of the sample, of the group that's going to deliberate. Of course, it will depend on how long the people will be required to be involved. But if in Chile we gathered 514 people, I would challenge you to not strive for less than that. Then about what? So we focus on concrete proposals. At the end of 2019, Chile had a huge crisis. A result of that was our constitutional process that is still open, but also a public consultation run by the municipalities in which more than 2 million people participated. Out of that consultation, the topics of pensions and health were prioritized. So we took that. But after that, we went to the proposals that were already in the table by think tanks all across the political spectrum for the last 10 years. We went through many proposals, no? And by doing so, we connected the knowledge of experts with this, the public deliberation. So we wanted the people to decide on what to do after those proposals, no? And the third element, and I'm going to close very quick, is how are opinions collected? Opinions can be collected in many ways, no? What we did in this implementation, because of the focus of our process in the political context in which we were, a context of crisis and a context that needed concrete decision-making. So we mixed the use of surveys with the transcriptions of the deliberations, the opinions expressed. I'm gonna skip this. So just as an example, we found big consensus on topics like the insurance of health policy. Here you can see, for example, a proposal of a structural reform to the system that got an 80% of support by the population because the sample was statistically representative. We know that this is what the country would say, no? And now this is the proposal that was incorporated in the government program of the current administration, is what's going to be presented. So we hope that this can have a direct impact on a very structural reform to the health system. We were able to unveil misinformation. You are observing here a very drastic fall in the support before the deliberation and after the deliberation to a specific policy. And that change is very connected to misinformation. And we also found other more complex results that we were able to analyze, bringing together the quantitative with the qualitative data. No, so things like that have been done in the US, not with the political buy-in that we got in Chile. Stanford ran this process in 2019, then did it online during the pandemic, bringing to around 1,000 people. I had a very nice video, but I'm already passed with the experience of that. I will post it in the chat. And yeah, I'm looking forward for the questions and comments. Thank you for the invitation. Sharing from the south of the continent to the north is also a pleasure.
Thank you, Tomas, for being with us today. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks, Tomas, so much for that presentation. That was really fantastic. Sounds like some incredible work was done in Chile. So, okay, we're going to move to Lenora Kamner, who is a Democratic Lottery advocate and co-director of Public Access Democracy. And Lenora is going to give her pitch for why we think the Citizens Assembly is the right solution for Los Angeles. So go ahead, Lenora.
Thank you so much. So this presentation is about the lottery selection possibilities for Los Angeles. So just a little bit of background to think about Los Angeles. You know, imagine that you're an unhoused person here in LA. You know, that's an experience that a lot of people are facing right now. And you go from service provider to service provider, and you call through every affordable housing list you can find, but there's still no luck. You have to navigate a maze of bureaucracy. And then at the end, there are just not enough homes available. So you start asking, who is in charge of this? In LA, the answer is everyone is in charge, but no one is in charge. Even the one agency that is supposed to oversee our response to homelessness doesn't have the ability to change the policies causing the crisis. And the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, LAHSA, has lost 2 directors in the past 3 years. And to quote former director Heidi Marston, who's pictured here, LAHSA was not given control over regulatory or policy decisions. Service providers remain underfunded, and dedicated frontline employees of nonprofit organizations and government entities are hamstrung by rules, red tape, and bureaucracy. Our democracy is in crisis here because our systems of government and participation are not working. I've been a volunteer in housing policy, and then I became the first staff member at Abundant Housing LA. We're a pro-housing advocacy organization. So I've been working to address the policy problems that are contributing to the housing and homelessness crisis. But it's clear to me now that even though most experts know the best policy solutions, there are systematic governance problems that prevent most of these solutions from being implemented. For example, experts and professionals calculate that Los Angeles has a large deficit of homes, especially affordable homes. But when the agency in charge of this calculation, SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, many people have never heard of it, when they actually set that number. And when they set that number, they actually ignore their own experts' advice. And this is a board of local electeds, they're pictured here, most of whom own their own homes. They're incredibly unrepresentative of most of the people in this region, and they have no real experience with the problems facing most people. And so even though they're not facing that urgency, they don't have personal experience with that, they're setting goals around housing, and they're setting goals that make their political lives easier and that helps them get elected in the future. And that makes the very problem they're supposed to be solving worse. Instead, if we had an impartial representative board, like a lottery selected board, that would go a long way to solving this problem. And that's what I'm going to talk more about. We have to start acknowledging that the problems here are not going to get better until we have a functional system of government and people in decision-making capacity who are capable of making these hard decisions. It's not just a matter of electing better people. I think that many people who run for office are great people with inspiring visions. And I think I see some of those people in the chat who are participating right now that they've had very inspiring visions for LA. And there's a lot of commitment to ethics and the greater good among candidates. But I think, we have to acknowledge this larger problem that power is corrupting. And it corrupts even people with the best intentions. And on top of that, the truth is most people probably don't have great intentions to begin with. So when we have a system of government that in order to get power and maintain power, it really depends on you, A, having to raise a lot of money to campaign, B, having the connections and networks to get party endorsements, and C, controlling who else gets elected, then it's no surprise that we have a lot of people in office who are using their power for their own careers instead of the greater good. It's kind of like built in to even succeed and continue in this process. So I've been doing a lot of political canvassing. I've been going door to door to voters. And what people tell me is that they just have no idea who to vote for. There are so many elections on the ballot, and it takes a lot of time and research to really understand all the issues and to understand all the viewpoints out there. So people that I'm hearing from, they're mostly relying on, for example, what was the last advertisement that they saw? How many mailers did they get? What did their political club endorse? So, I think that's what we're facing, is like something that's very controlled by money, because it's not realistic for voters. They're disempowered by this process. So no wonder there's so much corruption in LA. So just some, I think it's famous at this point, but just to go over some recent examples, former council member Mitch Englander was sentenced to federal prison last year for obstructing a corruption probe, or I think it was 2 years ago. Former council member Jose Huizar was indicted on bribery and other federal charges for favoring developers. Former council member Mark Ridley Thomas stepped aside after being charged with facilitating public contracts to the University of Southern California in exchange for favors. Although, of course, both Ridley Thomas and Huizar have pleaded not guilty and denied wrongdoing. And then, of course, there's the recent scandal involving the remarks made to undermine the redistricting process and like the racist remarks that were made by former council president Nori Martinez and other council members. So, you know, of course, it's not like we could expect to replace the government with a lottery system overnight. And I think like some people are having a discussion about that in the chat. But there are important areas where we could start implementing lottery selection to address Los Angeles's challenges. So here are some four ideas for areas where we could implement them today. So one, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about charter reform because of these very challenging issues that we're having in LA around corruption and broken processes. So I think charter reform is a really exciting idea. And I appreciate everyone who's joined, who's involved with that effort. I think we should see if there's a possibility of having lottery selection for that. And let me talk about that more on the next slide. I also want to talk about neighborhood councils. Thanks to those who brought that up in the chat as well. Redistricting commission, and finally, community input. So for charter reform, as the previous charter reform effort shows, that getting the composition of the commission right is so important for a successful process. The last time that this was done in LA, there were actually two separate competing commissions, an appointed and an elected commission. But people who are appointed need to have insider connections, and people who are elected need to be able to get endorsements and raise money. So it's still not accessible for the average person who doesn't make it their career. A paid charter reform commission selected by lot, on the other hand, would be more representative and independent than previous commissions. Neighborhood councils, thanks to those who brought that up in the chat. So neighborhood councils are intended to serve as the neighborhood's voice, but instead, I think we're seeing them serve as another layer of bureaucracy, which is dominated by particular viewpoints. Neighborhood councils have furthered, you know, some of them have unfortunately furthered the NIMBY not in my backyard problem, you know, which is kind of this collective action tragedy of the commons situation where, you know, we need more housing, we need more affordable housing, but, you know, every neighborhood says, okay, well, it should be somewhere else. So then you don't get enough of it in most places. Neighborhood councils could, on the other hand, really serve as the voice of their community if they had true representation and they were really accessible to the regular person through lottery selection, which would be like a statistically valid cross-section of that community. And also the next idea is redistricting commission. So in the wake of the recent LA City Council scandal, where the council members tried to undermine the work of the redistricting commission, there's work currently to reform the commission. Under the current system laid out in the city charter, city elected officials appoint members to the redistricting panel who can essentially act as their proxies. And the council then has final say over approving the maps. An independent commission, you know, why people believe in it is that it would take that power away from the council, with the district maps being adopted by the panel and filed with a city elections official. But if we could do a lottery selection for the commission, that would really maximize its independence and its ability to make impartial decisions about redistricting. Finally, community input. Community input is a huge problem, you know, that we see at Abundant Housing in terms of, you know, when housing decisions get made. Community input is this idea that local governments are going to hear from the community and the neighborhoods before they make a decision on anything. And it's, it sounds like a very helpful idea, but I think in practice, we see so many issues with it. So according to research about community input, there are self-selection issues with this process that causes amplification of privilege. And according to research from BU, community input meeting participants are 25% more likely to be homeowners and are significantly older, maler, and whiter than their communities. And then on top of this, there's this other problem that people are more motivated to participate in these processes when they're in opposition to something. So then again, you don't get a fair representation of what the community actually believes. And so because of this, this community input practice has been causing problems. Like it's been contributing to these crises and problems by amplifying NIMBY not in my backyard voices that are blocking necessary affordable housing and advocating for the continuation of exclusionary policies. On the other hand, lottery selection would make community input more representative of communities and would allow deliberation of facts and information instead of people showing up with one particular viewpoint to just shout at community meetings. So, so Lynn talked about this a little bit with the Petaluma example, but, I think it's so important what he said, that it's about getting away from this like debate, which I think for people who've been at some of these community input opportunities, like you've seen, it's like it turns into a shouting match. Like there's hate speech, there's violence, getting away from that and something that's more centered on facts and collaboration and discussion and deliberation. There's some examples of this being tried. For example, I want to shout out to a great example from Toronto, the Toronto Planning Review Panel. And then next, there's a video showing some participants from the Petaluma project who can speak on what that process was like for them being a panelist and that transformative potential. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lenora. I think we're going to play a video. That Lenora referred to. We're really crunched for time, so I'm going to ask, and we have asked the speakers if they can stay on past 11:30 to answer additional questions. So we'll play the video and then we'll go into the Q&A. If you have not done so yet and you're not the real Erica Re-Ray, please change your name. That'll help with your participation in the Q&A. If we could repost the instructions in the chat for how to change your name, that'd be super helpful because I'm seeing a lot of Erica Re-Rays on here. It's a bit of a glitch for the link that we sent out. We're not sure why it's happening, but Erica's cloned herself several dozen times now. So let's play the video and then we'll go into the Q&A.
It's a great process for democracy. I hope that there's many more things are resolved or decided through this process. Ultimately, I think no matter what happens, I feel like the public, the community will feel that they had an avenue for their feelings and thoughts, no matter how minor, from a ginormous expo hall to a butterfly garden, were represented and heard in this process.
The group is not necessarily the same people that seek out city government to be involved in things, and so it's I like that. I don't think anybody on this panel will not participate in another community thing ever. Everybody is more likely to participate.
We're more invested.
And more invested, in the community. And if that continues to happen, what community improvements will we see? If citizens actually are engaged.
First thing is, you have 36 people, different backgrounds. Most of them who didn't know each other, and are able to work together.
Just with politics the way it is, where they don't seem to want to communicate at all. And I think this is a perfect way to get politics not so political.
All right, great. There's a longer video that I believe we were going to post also in the chat if you want to see it, of the testimonials from Petaluma. Okay, so we should open it up for Q&A. Maybe we can start. Supposedly, if you unmute yourself, it will indicate to the Zoom moderators that you would like to ask a question. But in the meantime, maybe, I don't know if Laura or some of the other folks have been watching to collect questions, and we can start there.
Yes, we had a question from the chat from Fatima on whether participants have to opt in to be in the lottery. Are there requirements to do so?
Okay, Ramin, do you want to take that question?
Sure, I can take that. Yeah, the typical best practice looks like sending out 10,000 invitations by mail to randomly selected addresses in the geography of interest. So they go to the household, and then anyone from that household can respond to opt into the next phase of the lottery by sharing their demographic information. I'll just walk us forward from there. So from the 10,000, let's say we get 300 people that opt in. From those demographics, there's a process called stratified sampling to select panels that then map to the demographics of the larger place. So there's no requirements typically, other than just being a resident. You know, we often call these citizen panels or citizen assemblies, but this is citizen in the largest sense of the word. I think this is an opportunity to reclaim citizen. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, great. We also had a question. I think somebody was asking for more information about the Toronto example. I don't know if Lenora, you seem to be familiar with it. Maybe you wanted to take that.
Yeah, so, for the Toronto Planning Review Panel, I shared a link to it, and there's a video kind of explaining it. But it's very similar to the examples that were mentioned here, which is, it's like a lottery selected group to advise the Toronto Planning Department about their planning decisions around housing and transportation. And so, this video at the link kind of goes into how that lottery selection process led to diversity on that panel that they don't typically hear from. So for example, like there were voices speaking to their experience with like the transportation system in Toronto from their experience with disability, and that's something that hadn't been as incorporated into the planning department's decisions before that. But I think it's like you can see from that it was, it's very different from this community input process that we've all seen and are used to that can be so divisive and toxic. It's, people discussing issues, hearing facts and context, and collaborating on solutions.
Great, thank you. Mike, you've got your hand up.
Yes, we have another question in the chat, this one from Madeline. How are panelists protected from special interest groups?
That's a good question. Lynn, did you want to take that?
Sure, I can take that. Please add on if other folks have answers to this. So there's a few sort of procedural things that happen within these panels. I kind of describe them as somewhere between a jury and what we might normally think of as a public advisory body. So, for example, we only use first names in the panel. The panel has its own space, often its own interest, its own bathrooms, and there is an observer's gallery, but that's a separate space. It's monitored by staff, and panelists are sort of would keep in touch with panelists to make sure that, in some cases there have been nefarious attempts to try to influence the panel, but the only reason we know about those actually is because of panelists telling us about them. And really that's what it comes down to, is to design a space that sort of where panelists want to protect their own process. It shouldn't be us protecting it. We're there, to just sort of help create the space. And indeed, panelists, in our experience, get extremely protective over their own process quite quickly, and will be very upset when folks outside the process are trying to unduly influence them, or even are trying to influence them in sort of typical political ways within the process itself in presentations. And that often doesn't go over well in these environments, which we think is a great thing, because it sort of shows that the political nature of the political environment that hopefully we're creating is fundamentally different.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lynn. Okay, on my screen, I have Miriam Nichols. If you want to, if we can unmute Miriam. Just give us a
just a question. I wonder if somebody could elaborate on the funding for the councils. Somebody in the chat said it was grants, but where do they come from? Who bankrolls them?
Good question. I'm sure that it's different circumstances, different places, different circumstances for different, but maybe we could just use some examples. Yeva, you want to talk about how it was funded in Paris? Because they've done a couple of them.
Yeah, so I mean, usually in most of the examples that we also see in the OECD database, it is just public funds. It's just something that you budget for as a city council that you're going to spend money on. And this is exactly how it happens. Often cases, sometimes it also happens that it's jointly funded with a university or with philanthropy, but then still making sure that there is a overseeing of the whole package of the funding, that in a way that does not influence in any way the outcomes of the process. So it has to be very transparent. It has to be clear, stated on the let's say the assembly website where the money is coming from, and all of that.
Great. Thank you, Eva.
I would like to add just small comment on that. So what happens when you don't have the initial possibility for public funding? No. Our model considers what we call demonstrative experience, no? And that's key, no? And that's the role of the first deliberation you run, no? And for that, yeah, you can go to philanthropy, so on and so forth. But design that initial experience as a demonstrative experience that goes beyond the content, the specific content of the deliberation, but also that enables you to further develop this complement to the current institution of democracy to continue with public funding afterwards.
All right, thank you, Tomas. Wayne? Yeah, you can talk. You're unmuted.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Okay, Tomas, I have a question. There was recently a constitutional assembly in Chile that famously failed. I understand that was supposedly represented, but it was not randomly selected. Is that the case? And can you say if that contributed to its failure?
The topic of the constitutional convention, I think, would require a talk on itself. But what we had, it was for 1 year representative body that was elected by in the same way that our parliament is elected, no, through voting. We were able, and I saw a few other people that joined this event that were also involved, to get the Constitutional Convention to consider the methodology of the process that we ran as a complementary participatory mechanism, but unfortunately it wasn't implemented. I do believe that a randomly selected body could be of great help for the next stage of the constitutional process, which is still open in Chile. for different reasons. Trust being one of them, no? But yeah, the Constitutional Assembly didn't consider a random selection, at least in the previous version. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I just,
All right. Thank you, Tomas. Anna Genkova. Can we unmute Anna? Okay. Oh.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering, especially, I know this is an international type of panel, but in the US, particularly, there's a lot of demand on people's time. There's parents, there's people who do not have any guaranteed time off of work for any reason. So how do you ensure participation when we talked about representation? How do you ensure participation considering those demands and difficulties in people attending? Are people compensated? What is the process?
That's a very good question, Anna. And I think the advocates will tell you they have to go to great lengths to try to make it possible by providing resources and pay and all kinds of things to help people participate who are definitely time constrained and otherwise wouldn't be part of the process. But I'd love to hand it over to, I don't know, I'll open it to anybody who was on our panel to answer that. Is there anybody in particular who wants to tackle it?
I can just jump in and try and address it quickly. Some of this has come up in the chat. So by all means, pay for people's time. $20 to $45 an hour is a range that I've seen. So you could think a big portion of the panel's budget is actually being passed right back through to the citizen representatives to compensate for their time. In addition to that, it's ideal to offer child support and elder care support when possible, transportation support, technology support. There's almost like a concierge team that emerges to try and make this process accessible to the individual level. Again, this is all constrained by resources in the end.
I would add two other things to that. One is design the process for requiring as less from the people as possible, no? So of course, depending on the nature of the content you want to address, it will vary, but our deliberative process was 2 days and a half. No? That's because we focused on people deliberating on concrete proposals that were already developed. No? And on 2 days and a half, we got very, very impressive results. And the other thing is also considering the digital gap. So we bought internet plans for some people. We got municipalities supporting some people by enabling them to go to the municipality to hold the deliberation, or taking computers to the people's house. In everything that you can help to minimize the bias and to give equality, the best.
Okay, we have several more questions. At this point, though, I would like to try to take this survey or this poll. Now, the Erica Re-Ray cloning problem may complicate this a little bit, but I think we still should try to do the poll. We will be sending out in about 24 hours to everybody who participated, a sort of follow-up email and an opportunity to signal to us if you'd like to stay a part of this conversation and get involved in the effort to try to make one of these things happen. Most likely our target's going to be the LA City to begin with, but we are looking at doing something California-wide as well, potentially on homelessness. So if you want to stay involved, you can indicate that to us in as many ways as possible. But can we try to do the poll now? Here we go. And once you respond to this, I think you should see this on your screen. Once you respond to this, you will be able to see who responded and follow up with you. But we will also, as I said, we'll be sending out other emails, follow-up emails about this as well. So we'll wait a couple of minutes as that comes in. And as I said, some of our speakers can stay a little longer. So if you want to continue to stay on and ask some questions, we can do that. All right. Well, so far so good. Looks like there's a lot of interest. This is great. Okay, the poll will keep going. This is exciting. Okay, Mike, on my
Yes.
screen, you're the next person.
We have a few questions here in the chat. This one is from Marcos. They're asking, what's necessary for Los Angeles to adopt the Citizens Assembly? Who needs to make the political decision that would lead to its implementation? City Council?
It's a good question. Lenora, do you want to take that or try?
I can try. I don't necessarily know for all of them, but for neighborhood councils, I believe that would have to go through city council, or like that might even have to be charter reform. But maybe somebody who knows that could weigh in. But I know like some people who are working on the the current governance reform efforts are they're looking into what legal avenues we might potentially have for a lottery selected body, and like what kind of authority that could have. But one thing I mentioned in the chat is, I think one thing to remember is like we don't actually need to go through government in all cases to call a civic assembly. Like I prefer the term civic assembly to citizens assembly. So that's something I think that we should think about, is if it's not possible through the regular channels. I think people can really be empowered to do their own kinds of participation as well.
Yeah, I think in general with these processes, and it is different for different places, it can, they can be called by different advocates within the system, but what you do want most, what is important, I think, is that there's some sort of a government sponsor in the form of somebody who's looking to receive these recommendations, and hopefully a mandate that they must somehow respond or act on them, right? So it is a good idea that preferably it's wherever the seat of authority for that decision is being made, that's the advocates that looking for a citizens assembly or civic assembly input from participants and from the community to in which direction they should go. Ideally, that's what you have. Calling them, outside of government can create public pressure, of course, but no guarantee that anything will necessarily result from them. So, and there have been examples where the mandate wasn't clear up front, and sure enough, not very much happened afterwards. So one thing I think to realize is that as much as we've had 600 incredible, events so far, and these things are proliferating through governments, I think the movement itself is still in its infancy. We are still learning the process of how to do this right. I think a lot of people we've gained a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience, but there are still lessons to be learned. And every citizens assembly or civic, participatory process that's launched and executed, we learn from. So, okay, Brenda, I can't really see the rest of the name. Brenda Akoth Ogembo. Okay. Now I can see it. Can we unmute Brenda? Can Brenda unmute herself? I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. Wait. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks to all the presenters. I had a question for Tomas, actually. With the success and the fact that you were so heavily, I'm speaking from the Global South, so obviously your case was very interesting to me. With the fact that you had so many development partners, external partners to government funding, and then had so much success, how much would you say there has been interest in government to take this up? How, that they're willing to put money behind this, they're willing to run another citizens assembly, outside of waiting for development partners? And to what degree do you think that the cost of what it took, I know deliberative polling is cheaper than citizens assemblies, but does the cost look like something the government would be willing to build into their budget? What was the kind of feedback from bureaucrats who would be running such processes? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First, I gotta say that we got way more partners than funding, actually. No? The effort we did was an endeavor in all the sense, and it was quite a big challenge. No? So we did it in a time in which the results came out during the elections. So, and the beginning of the constitutional process. No? So it is just now that we are having very, very interesting conversations with the current administration on how to move forward, both to give impact to the results on the specific topics, but also to institutionalize the methodology. My personal goal is not focused on having more deliberative process as single experiences, because I think that's very weak. No? So I expect that we can move forward giving a proper, independent, well-funded institutionalization for this. It is a challenge ahead. There is interested. One of the very, very important things that have happened is that it gets very good opinions across the political spectrum. So you can find people from the right, left, and all the positions you can imagine saying this is good. No? So I think it will take some time. It's not a sprint. This is a long-term challenge. And the experience of one country will also open the road for others. So that's why also these events are so important. What's going on or what could happen in Los Angeles will be helpful for Chile and the other way also.
All right, thank you, Tomas. Okay, we have a question from Alejandra Ponce de Leon.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm excited. I'm really inspired about this idea of, civic assemblies, citizen assemblies. And for us at Catalyst California, we're based here in LA. We're really about, committed about how do we redesign our public systems to advance racial equity and racial justice. And so for me, I'm thinking of like, well, how does this get applied? But I would really love to hear, what are some lessons learned so far? Like in thinking about LA, wanting to integrate this, implement this here, what are some major lessons learned? What have been barriers, still that you're grappling with, or challenges that you've seen embedded within this structure or this process that could be really, helpful in educating us and thinking about how do we, tailor it to LA?
That's a big question. I don't know. My sense is it's an open question at this point, right? I mean, what we want to do, and I think, Leonora's presentation aside, which I think was great, was one of the things we'll have to do is kind of go into a design process leveraging all the information we have and all these resources and all this expertise to try to figure out how to make this work in the context of Los Angeles. So it's not easy to sort of, there's so many lessons that have been learned, but I don't know if anybody, Ramin or anyone else on our speakers list has something to reflect as a lesson learned that they think they could apply to the Los Angeles context.
I might offer just some of the general lessons learned. As we've heard time and time again, these methods make a difference on issues that are stuck and meaningful in a community. So selecting something that is top of mind and is going to kind of pierce through the noisy attention landscape we're in I think is question one. Again, that could be homelessness, that could be water, that could be any number of issues in LA, I'm sure. Two is being wise about the framing of the question, because there's only so much that can be tackled even in 50 or 100 hours of deliberation, which would be a long process, let alone the shorter processes that Tomas was also pointing to that have great wisdom and can do a lot in 2.5 days. So the framing of the remit is sometimes the technical term there. I find if I had a magic wand, more of these processes would be integrated with broader participation in the community up front and throughout. So we're going on a community learning journey around this issue, and more than just the panelists are having a felt experience of a different type of politics, sitting at the table with people in a way where we're holding more of the trade-offs and complexities together. But this is kind of in the weeds process design. And then finally, on the action side, we talk about participatory, sense-making, decision-making, but participatory action is just as important. And policy is just one lever of change. We know that there's a lot of power that we hold from civil society, from businesses, from just, down to community members, and being skillful at taking the North Star that comes out of this citizen process and catalyzing action across the whole system of the community. So I would say these are kind of emerging best practices.
Great.
Yeah. Could I add on to that really fast?
Sure.
I think just to emphasize that point, I think thinking of these things as systemic interventions is so important. Whatever the realities of the actual project is, as I mentioned, but even in, let's say, a one-time project on a specific issue, there's a lot that can be done to sort of create the infrastructure, or start to create the infrastructure that could then be transformed into a permanent redistricting commission, or a permanent, advisory body to a planning commission, or a planning department, or a charter commission with real power to send things directly to the ballot, or any level of sort of potential, power in a permanent way, and the one of the big kind of things that I think we are doing a lot of thinking about is the pre and post democratic stuff on all sides of the assembly, which Ramin sort of alluded to as well, like how information comes into the process, how the selection, how all the decisions about the selection and the design happen, and how those can all happen in a way that is up to the sort of democratic standards of the assembly itself. And likewise, how the assembly's results, how its recommendations or results can be sort of carried on by the assembly itself in new ways, paid for by the project itself, importantly, and not sort of left to a final report that might be at risk of sitting on a shelf. All these kind of things that of course we know from lots of different kinds of public processes as being risks.
Thank you, Lynn. Mike, you have your hand up?
Yes, we have another question from the chat here. This one is from Maggie. Their question is, has the citizen assembly model been adapted for use with youth councils?
Anybody know any of examples? Wayne?
I'll only offer there is a organization.
Wayne. Sorry, Wayne's.
Wayne, you're trying to speak? Yeah, please unmute. Go for it.
Thank you.
There. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. A guy named Adam Cronkite began a movement in Bolivia to have student councils selected by lot. He brought it over to the United States, and there's a movement to do that. And I think he's still active. You can find him on a website. It's called Of by Four. I wanted to say one other thing about what I wanted to pick up on what Lynn said about the idea of commissions and panels. It's not just the citizens' assemblies themselves where this tool of lottery selected groups is useful. It's very useful for our commissions and panels. We have many commissions and panels in California that are thoroughly corrupted by the appointment process. The Public Utilities Commission is an example. In that case, it would take a constitutional amendment to change that. But just to give everyone hope, we all know the results, the electoral results in Michigan. Somehow, Michigan became a state that had a more representative election, and the reason for that was because of a constitutional amendment that took redistricting out of the hands of the state legislature and put it into the hands of a panel of 13 randomly selected citizens in Michigan. And that was on the ballot a few years ago, and that's been implemented. And it was that commission that redrew the districts in Michigan to make them more fair and to end gerrymandering in Michigan. There are other states where that can happen too. That's kind of a no-brainer, low-hanging fruit for citizen assembly.
So I just wanted to bring up a question that I saw in the chat, which was from Klaus, who asked, well, why do we need a parallel process? Why don't we just fix the process we have? And I think these examples of changing the way these commissions or committees or whatever are appointed and using citizens panels instead are actually an example of how we go about changing the system we have. The problem is, in the system we have, there are so many levels of conflict of interest, and self-interest actually operates throughout the processes that are cross-government, that until we sort of intervene with the citizen's voice, those processes aren't likely to change very quickly. So this is actually a tool for creating potentially a more perfect electoral representative democracy. And it's been a very powerful tool up to now, where it has been used very often for exactly that purpose. And redistricting is a great example of that. So there may be a world down the road where we have a much more deliberative democracy, and actually representative democracy itself is in some people's vision, it goes away completely. I don't know if I can see a world like that. But I do believe that the only way that we're going to change the system we have now in the right direction is through these processes. So there was Thorsten Sturck.
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. It's Thorsten because it's a Swedish name. It has nothing to do with the English at the H, but it's okay.
Okay.
Jeva even has a much more difficult name. I want to come back to the question on youth assemblies. As I wrote in the chat, there have several youth assemblies been taking place. For example, in Ireland with a citizens assembly on biodiversity. There was also a children's and young people assembly on this topic. And there have been youth assemblies in German city of Brandes, also in Copenhagen, in Stavanger in Norway, and in Idaviru in Estonia. You can find information on our website. I posted several times in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Please post it again. I'll definitely click on it so you can learn more. Yeah, Mike?
I have one more question from the chat here from Lorraine. Lorraine asks, in some ways, it seems that many of the benefits of a citizen assembly could be accomplished through really good polling. Could you say a little bit more about what kind of outcomes can be accomplished by an assembly that could not be accomplished by in-depth polling?
I'd love to hand that off to any of the experts. Ramin or Lynn or Yeva. I mean, yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question.
Yeah, we haven't heard from you in a while. I offer to you if you'd like to take that.
Yeah.
All right, sure. Thank you. Well, I mean, even like not necessarily even polling, but even other participatory mechanisms, in a way, they really just aggregate the individual people's opinions and give us an overview of what, the distribution of different opinions across a place. But in a deliberative process, you can find a rough consensus and you see where all of these people, the diversity of them, where they actually meet and what is the solution that actually everyone can be happy with. So it's a completely different starting point. And then with this sort of consensus that a broadly representative community can bring to you, then the decisions that you can take and the action that you take is then not going to disadvantage any different groups, and groups have actually been involved in this decision making and have deeply deliberated and discussed how they might be affected. So there are so many different benefits. I see them as completely a different process in its entirety. And I think, actually, I disagree with some of the speakers that said that we have to make the process as efficient and as fast as possible. I disagree. I think deep deliberation actually requires time and requires that, we actually need to consider all of these different opinions. We have great space to hold this complexity, to find this rough consensus, to build it step by step. So then once we found it, we can then implement it without hesitation. And then the decisions that are taken are sustainable for the future.
It's a really good answer. Thank you, Yeva. And just to add to that, I mean, I think the concern for how much time this is taking, of course, goes straight to the question of how do we get citizens to participate? How do we ensure that everybody can, given the constraints of time, money, and so on? And so that there is a tension there. And what I think the vision, the future vision of a more deliberative democracy is that there are resources available because we consider this a really important part of the public deliberation process and policymaking. And therefore, there are, there's sort of governing, institutions and regulation and so on that make it, people get time off work and that time is paid for. And this becomes part of your civic responsibility to come together and help make decisions and learn from each other. So yes, in a vision of a more deliberative democratic future, there would be accommodations for this kind of activity, and it would be a calling we all sort of live up to, essentially, to participate and to support our community this way. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So maybe we've done it. Everybody's fully convinced and we're going to go forward, and this is it. Lynn, did you want to say something?
I actually sort of wanted to ask Yeva if about that point that you just made, because it might be a nice sort of inspiring thing to end on. One of these really important processes that happened, that was the precursor to the Paris one, was in Belgium, as Yeva mentioned. And it's a small community of about 80,000 folks, I think. And this whole assembly process has been made permanent as a part of their government system there. And Yeva, I just wondered if you could say anything about, I feel like that's one of the first places where at least I'm really looking forward to seeing how this changes the very way that folks in a community think about governance and democracy. Because I think it's every so many years, every single adult in that community will have received an invitation because it's relatively small and ongoing. I don't know, Yeva, if you wanted, anything to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Yes, indeed, it's a really exciting example, and it's already been happening for 3 years and inspired all of these other bigger cities like Paris to do something similar. And I was actually there at the end of September, and I had an opportunity to really speak with the members of this regional parliament. And also I asked them, how has this actually, did it have an impact on the way that they interact amongst themselves, on the political culture, actually, even. And I was really surprised also to hear that they told me that because there is this whole other actor, this assembly of citizens that are really non-partisan and they don't really care about these partisan lines, they didn't really know how to interact with them. So they actually had to learn to communicate about the ideas and differently. And so this, in a way, they had to work together in between party lines to then collaborate with citizens. And this has also changed the way the representatives actually interact within amongst themselves. So I found this really inspiring in a way that then these more institutionalized processes create the opportunities for the political and social culture to change. And of course, beyond that, the fact that citizens at this point, almost, because it's a very small community, almost everyone knows someone who has actually already participated in such a process. Well, hopefully the trust in the community is increasing. We don't yet have the data on the evaluation on this, but I think the anecdotal evidence is quite clear that that's the case. So I think it's a beautiful example that's going to continue in the future, and they really do not even question whether it has to continue because they know that it does.
Oh, that's super exciting, Eva. That's really exciting. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the transformative effect that it has on the people who participate, right? And if you aggregate that, then it becomes a transformation of your political culture, right? Less polarized and whatever. I hadn't thought of the effect on the policymakers themselves. That's actually a really, really exciting transformation. I think we need to get the politics out and the partisanship out of our democracy as much as possible so that we can come to better decision making. It hasn't been helpful It's certainly not helpful right now, the depth of polarization we're experiencing. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for participating and for being, starting this step on this journey with us. The poll results were really encouraging. A lot of people want to stay involved in this effort, so that's super exciting. And we will definitely be back in touch with you to tell you what our next steps are and to, get your help, your support, your ideas and your participation. So thank you again so much for being part of this and making this such an exciting event. We were much more successful than we thought we would be, given all the people that participated. So thank you so much. And thank you to the speakers and for the folks who put this together. All right, signing off. Bye.